Hello, everyone. Today's topic has especially been created for educators and teachers, and it's titled It's Not Just Loud. It's all about the neuroscience of noise. Pleased to welcome Dr. Giulia Poerio to this conversation. Giulia is a psychologist and a researcher with the University of Sussex, whose work focuses on the science behind autonomous sensory meridian response, or ASMR, which is a phenomenon that many people experience as a deeply calming response to certain gentle cues and sensory sounds. Over the past decade, Julia has been one of the leading researchers exploring how ASMR affects the body and the mind, including how it can influence relaxation and emotional well-being and stress. At the Peace Path and HushAway, we are really interested in the role this sound can play in supporting emotional regulation, especially for children who feel overwhelmed by the pace and stimulation of this modern world that we live in. Julia joins our Peace Path conversations as a research advisor, helping ensure that the ideas that we explore around sound remain thoughtful and grounded in research. And today we're focusing on schools and classrooms where noise is often simply accepted as part of daily life, but neuroscience tells us that sound plays a really powerful role in attention, stress, and emotional regulation, particularly for children at school. So, Julia, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, let's talk about busy classrooms. And sometimes the noise is really unavoidable. But from a neuroscience perspective, how does that constant background noise in classrooms affect a child's brain and their ability to focus and learn?
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that, the auditory system that we have is kind of constantly processing information from the environment all the time, and in a classroom, it's not necessarily going to be kind of these loud sounds, but it might be people talking, whispering, people, chairs scraping, trying to hear what the teacher's saying at the same time. So, we're constantly trying to process sounds to decide what's relevant and important to us.
Mhm.
Um, a really good example of this is something called the cocktail party phenomenon. So there's this idea that, even in a crowded room where you've got like a cocktail party, which I don't know if these things happen anymore, but, you've got lots of background noise. If somebody says your name, you're going to notice and pay attention to it,
Yeah.
right? So we do tend to try and prioritize sensory information that is relevant to us. But there are kinds of kind of background noises that can actually be very distracting and affect our ability to process, when we need to. So, an example might be, a child's really trying to read or focus on a bit of text that they're trying to do, but they've got to work quite hard to kind of suppress the fact that other people are whispering or talking around them, or that they can hear traffic noise outside and all of those sorts of things. So what's happening when you're trying to process a lot of competing sensory information, whether it's coming from, auditory modality or otherwise, is that it's distracting, it's increasing, your cognitive load. And particularly in school setting, even the moderate levels of background noise can affect your ability to pay attention and also what we call executive function. So things like, the ability to switch tasks or to hold information in working memory. And so these effects can in turn have kind of negative impacts on learning because of the sensory environment.
Mhm. And some teachers often notice how some students seem to be able to concentrate despite noise, while others really struggle. So, why do certain children experience classroom noise more intensely?
Yeah, I think there probably is quite a lot of good evidence to suggest that, classroom noise does affect attention and learning in general. But this is, of course, going to be particularly affecting children with heightened sensory sensitivity, where the negative effects are going to be amplified, on their nervous system, but also on their learning. And so, we talk about kind of heightened sensory sensitivity or heightened auditory sensitivity, where essentially kind of we're all processing this information, but people with high sensory sensitivity will be processing that information in much more depth. So they're going to notice subtle sounds a lot more, like, people chattering in the background. They're going to be more reactive to them. And they're also going to be less able to kind of filter them out as background noise. So background noise for some people is really not faded into the background at all. And this is really to do with differences in the ways that different people's brains process sensory information. So people with high sensory sensitivity have got much lower thresholds for sensory input for reaching conscious processing, and that does make them more reactive to sensory information. So essentially, you've got this situation where not only have you kind of got more sensory information or sounds kind of coming in when you've got high sensitivity, but you're less able to kind of keep irrelevant information filtered out as kind of background noise, as it were.
And so when a child is overwhelmed in that noisy classroom, what's really happening in their nervous system?
Yeah, so I mean, sensory information and sounds and also sights and touch, these things have got very kind of strong links to emotional systems, particularly sound, actually. And this, of course, is actually a really helpful thing, right? Because these sensory emotional pathways, allow us to respond to stimuli that are dangerous, right? So,
Mhm.
for example, if you smell a fire, you might go, body's in panic, and then you flee from the situation. So
Mhm.
this is a useful thing. But if you are somebody that's sensitive, or you've really reached your capacity for sensory stimulation, the nervous system, can tag information that isn't really dangerous as sort of more like a threat, and the environment is not safe, and that can kind of induce feelings of stress but also affect physiological arousal. So essentially, you're getting this situation in which a stress response is activated. So the sympathetic nervous system, which is a branch of the autonomic nervous system, goes into this fight or flight, sometimes freeze response, which
Mhm.
is a naturally adaptive one because it's kind of mobilizing your resources for survival. But it's only adaptive when it matches the actual threat level.
Mhm.
So, there's this kind of mismatch really between certain sense of information coming in and the way that the body's responding to it as a kind of threat.
Mhm.
And so this can kind of manifest in itself in kind of physiological reactions, like increased heart rate, increased cortisol levels. But sometimes it can also look like a kind of a blunting of response, or a kind of a shutdown as well. So disconnecting from physiological responses. But it's essentially the body's way of trying to kind of regulate threats. So it's this idea that, something in the system needs to be rebalanced. And of course, if this is happening in the context of a learning environment like classrooms are, our attentional systems are going to be much more geared towards kind of resolving the perceived threat rather than, trying to learn, or try and think about what's being said. So it is really a kind of an adaptive response, but it's just not occurring in the right context necessarily for everybody.
Mhm. And we also talk about visual distractions in classrooms, but sound is constant. So how does that kind of auditory environment really influence that concentration, memory, and emotional regulation for children?
Yeah. I mean, I think arguably all auditory environments are actually more important than visual ones in the classroom environment, because actually a lot of what's happening in that setting is about communication and learning. So the ability to hear and process what is being said by a teacher is often how we learn. So when you've got kind of other auditory distractions, you've got competition for what to process. So you've got lots of auditory streams going on. You've got the teacher speaking to you, but you've also got people chattering in the background, traffic noise, and things like that. And so if you aren't somebody that's very good at filtering out irrelevant auditory information, like the background noise, that's really going to have an impact on your ability to focus and retain what's being said, because it's just so distracting. And then, of course, you've got the added problem of that, okay, if you've missed something that's been said because you haven't being able to focus on it because you've been dealing with other kind of auditory streams, then it can be really hard to follow, the flow of what's happening. Students will often say this to me when I give lectures of, oh, I lost you at this point and then I couldn't get back to what you were saying. And
Mhm.
so I think that's sometimes why repetition can be helpful in learning context to kind of get people back up, back up to speed. So yeah, I think it is something that can really affect concentration and your ability to remember. Also, if you're dealing with these things, it affects your energy levels. It's quite tiring, which also then has an effect on kind of subsequent learning. So there's lots of things that are potentially going on here.
Mhm. And just why is that? Because we know that unpredictable noise can disrupt learning, as you say, and some forms of sound seem to support calmer focus. But why is it that predictable, gentle sounds can sometimes help the brain settle? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to this idea of predictability. And the way that our brains work is that they really like to make predictions about things. They like things that are easy to process. So when you've got this context of kind of predictable rhythmic sounds or predictable visual input, so if you can kind of control the auditory environment with these kind of repetitive sensory stimuli, you're basically decreasing the amount of kind of cognitive effort that's engaged in attention allocation. So you're making processing much more predictable and efficient. And that means that you can kind of allocate your other kind of cognitive resources or attentional resources to things like learning. And that's also probably why people, will often say that it helps them to concentrate if they listen to music or certain sounds, or that they have some sort of predictable background noise to focus on, because you're having a kind of a stream of input that is very predictable and is not distracting. And there is kind of some interesting evidence as well to suggest that, if you're getting this kind of predictable auditory input, it can help regulate the autonomic nervous system by activating the parasympathetic branch, which is a kind of rest, digest, relaxation response. And so that might also kind of support feelings of calm, which in themselves are also more conducive to a learning environment as well.
And talking about the learning environment, and as awareness of neurodiversity grows, and we know that more and more neurodivergent children are moving from those kind of special schools into mainstream schools. We now need to really focus on that environment at schools. So what small shifts can schools, educators, teachers make to create these more supportive sound environments for children?
I mean, I think this is a really, really interesting kind of area of work that's happening, around this idea of kind of inclusive design, particularly in classroom environments. So I'm sure you're aware there's kind of, work going on that is saying that essentially, UK standards for background noise and echo in classrooms are just not good enough for inclusive learning. And what we really need to be doing is to try and reduce these things by having different and updated standards that really accommodate diverse sensory needs. And actually, one of the things that, I think can sometimes happen in a classroom environment is that, you might move some students who are struggling, to a separate room, which is not great for inclusion either. And actually what we need is just better systems of ensuring that, classrooms in mainstream schools are meeting kind of acoustic standards that benefit everybody, especially those with additional sensory needs. But I think more generally, that's a kind of a broader policy type thing. But I think generally just being aware of sensory processing differences would be really helpful. And, certain accommodations to help particular, students struggling could be more regular break summaries, other opportunities to support emotion regulation for those who are feeling overwhelmed so they can kind of get back to their baseline. I think there are these kind of small things that can happen, but really I think systemic change it is probably needed too.
So those little accommodations, for any teachers or educators listening today, what would you encourage them to start noticing about the sound in the classroom, in the environment, that they might previously have overlooked?
Yeah. I mean, I think just trying to notice and be more aware of the sensory environment, the background noise, the amount of echo that's happening, and also just maybe trying to pick up, subtle signals or signs from students that might be struggling with attention and concentration, and whether that might have some sort of correlation to levels of background noise or what's going on. Um, Also, I think awareness that these things probably accumulate over the day or might be worse at particular times of day could also be helpful. So trying to recognize, are there certain times of the day or certain periods of transitions which are particularly problematic when it comes to noise. The other thing I think, and teachers probably recognize this and educators recognize this, is, that responses to sensory overwhelm and sensory differences, that they're not a reflection on how much necessarily a student wants to learn or pay attention. It's really just kind of the body's way of prioritizing what it perceives to be kind of a response to threat over and above learning. So I think it's not that, learning can't happen or that students don't want to learn. It's just, it is kind of an automatic process of prioritizing what is perceived to be a threat from the sensory world.
Mhm. Giulia, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insight and your research with us today. So, what this conversation highlights is that sound is not just something that we manage in classrooms, it's something that shapes attention, stress, and emotional regulation for many children, students. As awareness of neurodiversity and neurodivergence grows, it becomes increasingly important that we design environments that support how children actually experience the world rather than expecting them to simply cope with it. We're very grateful to have Giulia helping us guide these conversations through the peace path. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to explore more conversations like this with our experts, you can find them through the peace path and through HushAway, where we continue to explore how sound can support calm, focus, and emotional regulation for our children. So you can find us at hushaway.com. Thank you.